Chapters 7, 8, 9, maybe 7, 8. We'll see how far we get. These are a couple long chapters. I'm kind of worn out. I had an epic half marathon running race today. I'm going to get into more details on that tomorrow in a podcast. But one of our sponsors was from Broken Tooth Brewing. Moose's Tooth, Beartooth, Anchorage, Classics, Rock, Paper, Citrus. I'm going to crack this open. This is one of the giveaways. And I got a couple beers. Pretty good deal. It's pretty tasty. Alrighty. Yeah, Moose's Tooth. So this chapter's called The Glacier Creek Climbing Compound. So we'd left off climbing Sunshine Ridge with Andy, super scary, free solo type stuff. At the time, I lived in the house with Andy and two other bachelor types for about 8 months. I moved out on February 10th, year 2000. On February 8th, 2000, I decided on climbing Mount McKinley, also now known as Mount Denali, the following spring, so I figured I needed more hands-on winter camping experience. The roommates turned out to be flexible and they found my replacement in 2 days. My plan was to move into the squatter's cabin I had built 2 years prior, during my senior year in high school. My friend Todd and I had built the original structure and we called it the Glacier Creek Climbing Compound, or just the compound for short. It was perched in the trees on a cliff 50 feet above the green waters of Glacier Creek, about 2 miles up Crow Creek Road in the back of Girdwood Valley. We were climbers and figured the compound would be a good place to hole up if not live for free with a $1 million view of Alyeska. The structure was built with 2x4s, plywood, and tarp combo for the roof. My parents called it a tar paper shack. They seemed more skeptical of my romantic notion of living in the woods. I was not a bum though. I had a full-time job as a pro ski patroller at Alyeska Resort. It was perfect. I was outside in the elements all day doing avalanche ski cuts in the early morning, then on to high-speed groomers during night skiing. At the end of the day, I would change and dry my ski gear in the locker room. I would usually hang out at a friend's house or the bar, until I managed to force myself to drive up the single-lane gravel road, stop the car, and turn into the dark woods by myself. I don't care who you are during the day, the woods at night can really play on your imagination. After a couple weeks, I came used to it and stopped carrying my shotgun to and from the car. Yeah, that was kind of a bit of effort, moving in dark woods. It's horrible. I had nowhere to go except go to my little place. I'd drive up and then park. Anyway, I was not the first or only person who had decided to live for free in the expensive resort town. People have been squatting in Girdwood for 20 years. The government would on occasion go through and run the hippies out, but they kept coming back. I had met Hans on the ski hill. He too was living like a king in his own palace up Crow Creek Road. He was closer to town but further from the roads, if that makes sense. He had just moved to Girdwood from Anchorage, where he had been a real bum for the last 6 months. I guess before that he played French horn for the New York Symphony or Manhattan School of Arts, I think. He just decided to pick up one day and move to Alaska to be a bum, like literally dumpster diving and killing all day at the public library. He was smart, and more importantly, a bum by choice. He hosted a radio show on the local pirate station. He would play classical music with intelligent commentary and the occasional quote from Nietzsche. Hans was obsessed with the quest for knowledge in general, and I was obsessed with the quest for climbing new mountains, so we got along. I would remind Hans to keep his hands forward and how to stomp a cliff, and he would remind me to question reality. I knew Hans had normal parents back in Tacoma who missed him, but as Hans put it, they were too normal, and he would get annoyed that my parents were too normal, and I would get irritated because I did not know what that meant. Hans's treehouse was impressive. It was 40 feet straight up in 4 trees. Apparently he built the entire structure by himself using ropes to hang from and to haul all the plywood and 2x4s. I went out to visit his place a few times, and each time I was stricken by fear just climbing the rope ladder to the hatch in the floor. After a couple of seasons he felt that the building was unsafe because of the wind always blowing the trees around and loosening all the nails. He moved closer to town and built a pyramid out of canvas and 2x2s. Around the same time he shaved all the hair on his head, including the eyebrows, so we started calling him Mummy. So he literally lived in a pyramid-shaped thing. He looked like a mummy. My place was on Glacier Creek, where Hans's place was on California Creek, a small tributary of Glacier Creek. At the back of California Creek drainage is Fish's Breath, a huge pyramidal-shaped mountain with the most aesthetic, smooth flanks on any mountain in south-central Alaska. That could be debated, but it is quite a nice mountain. People always said that it would take 2 days to climb and ski, but I guessed about 6 hours. The mountain is called Fisher's Breath because a miner, back 100 years ago, was prospecting up the drainage and came face to face with a huge grizzly bear. He was so close to it and he could smell the rotting fish on its breath. Mummy and I skied up to the base of the prominent east-facing ridge in 2 hours. I told him that if he broke trail up the whole ridge, we would call the route Mummy's Ridge. He thought that was a good deal and proceeded to boot pack straight up the ridge for the next hour and a half. I even offered to help when he became tired, but he refused, and we topped out in 3.5 hours from the road. The thing about Hans was that he was guaranteed to crash on every single run. No joking. At the bottom of most every single resort run, he would roll in late, all covered in snow, as if he just ragdolled half the mountain. This run was no different. To a skier, the untracked snow is like a palette on which we express our art in the form of the ski turn. Hans was like one of those artists who would cover a room in canvas and start kicking over cans of paint and, if not throwing feces on the wall. Since he broke trail, he obviously would have first tracks on the coveted slope. He dropped in and did not one turn for what seemed like forever. The slope turned out to be 3 times bigger than it first appeared, as Hans is a small speck still straight lining across the 45-degree astral plane of white light. Right on cue, he explodes into a ball of snow and ski gear. One ski took off and Hans was left sliding on his butt the remaining 2,000 feet. I zippered about 1,000,000 powder turns and checked on Hans, who was super stoked on breaking through another boundary of the imagination. Life was not always so rosy in the pyramid. I guess during construction Hans used real black tar as an adhesive for his canvas-walled building. He became dreadfully ill with a lung ailment and had to crash at a friend's couch. In effect, he was living inside a cigarette. Once he had healed enough to do something about it, he organized a house-burning party. He burned his house and most possessions to the ground. A couple of days later, there was Hans's smoldering building on the front page of the local newspaper. A local do-gooder was appalled to have come across the charred remnants so near his home and business. In reality, the whole valley could have gone up in smoke, so the government initiated another seek-and-destroy mission aimed at pushing the squatters out. Luckily, the compound is well hidden and stands there to this day. It's true, it's still there. 22 years later. Side story, when I brought Vesna back here from Canada, I said we're going to go. I was like, I got a cabin we can live in. We'll go live in this thing. And we rolled into town and luckily had found another place to stay. And it was a couple of weeks later we actually went out to check out the cabin. I was like, this is where we're going to be staying. And right at the start of the road, there was a dead moose, like some moose kill, like so gnarly, rotten dead moose right on the trail. So it was kind of bad feng shui. And it was good we weren't living there. Next chapter is called The Indestructible Few. So crazy, I wrote all this stuff years ago and I don't remember half the stuff. Well, this is why you write things down, people. Because you don't forget. You forget your own life and then you read it and you're like, oh, wait, got it. The Indestructible Few. Abe and Hans did not always get along. Hans was too pompous and self-righteous to come down to Abe's sophomoric humor, which I appreciated. In that sentence, it's kind of tough. I appreciated Abe's sophomoric humor. I didn't appreciate Hans's being too self-pompous. Anyway, one night, Hans invited Abe and I to come on his radio show as guests. I was driving, and Abe pounded about 10 beers over the previous hour leading up to the show. So with classical music playing softly in the background, Abe explaining in great detail the explicit specifics of his latest sexual encounter. I remember bits of reverse cowgirl in Mom's living room, porn on TV, Mom comes home. Like always, I was immensely entertained by all of it. The station manager, however, was not, and Hans was fired the next day. It was around this time that we started skiing with Fred Bull. I met Fred at one of his infamous house parties. Fred lived with his bachelor father, and they had a blast for a few years at least. His dad was the owner and creator of the Iditarod Adventure Race Series. Contestants would either cross-country ski, snowshoe, or run or bike the same route as the famous dog sled race called the Iditarod. The course goes from Anchorage to Nome over 1,000+ miles in the dark of winter. Fred was somewhat famous in the obscure endurance mountaineer circles of Alaska, and I was honored when he called me and said we should ski. I agreed, and we set off on many a night of drinking, followed by early starts and long days in the dark mountains. I did a lot of skiing in the night with Fred. Sometimes we'd go all day and come home in the dark, but sometimes we'd not start climbing till 8 o'clock at night. Fred was not a ski bum. He loved to ski every day possible, but he also had a strong work ethic and would not be caught not working. He was a carpenter by trade and built like his name suggests. I was working on the ski patrol all day and just bursting to get out into the backcountry whenever possible. One season we went night skiing about 3 nights a week. Good headlamp could go a long way, but intimate knowledge of the mountain's objective features is worth way more. It's amazing to follow the tunnel vision of light beam as the cold powder cushions every turn. One night we climbed up the south side of Max's chute in a snowstorm. The lights from the Day Lodge parking lot barely illuminating the snow as the wind blew. The chute is pretty straightforward as far as ski cuts go. So one by one we zigzagged across the chute and yelled directions into the night, hopping from safe zone to safe zone. Another night we skied the head wall in early season conditions. The main chute was narrow and rocky with mandatory cliffs in the dark. On the smooth face below, I remember seeing an avalanche tear away to my right, so I veered left and continued with my turns. The next day you could see my tracks with a fairly large slab and debris at the bottom. In general, our confidence grew. We had to make rules, though. You can only drink as much as you climbed, i.e. 1,000 feet equaled 1 beer, 2,000 feet equaled 2 beers, etc., until you reached 5,000 feet climbed. At that point, you could really party. The thing is, though, once you climbed 5,000 feet, you'd only have 2 or 3 beers anyway before you had to go to sleep. It's really pretty effective. Back then when you were trying to power drink, 20-year-old, it was a nice little rule. It worked. Fred taught us all the skills for endurance winter backcountry travel. Attitude is everything. Prior proper planning prevents piss-poor performance. We came up with a club and called ourselves the Indestructible Few, a take on the Marine saying, the few, the proud, the Marines. We death marched through the mountains trying to climb as much vertical as possible, trying to feel alive. Oh, yeah. Those were the days. Zero responsibility. No fear all the time in the world. Go try to kill yourself. Next one's called Crow Pass. Abe and I set out on many such combination trips. One of the more outright dangerous trips was when we biked over Powerline Pass with skis on our backpacks to climb and ski the North Face and Couloir on Ptarmigan Peak. It only took about an hour to reach the base of the climb. Abe was classic in that his gear was usually falling apart or inadequate in general, this being the case when his backpack strap broke soon into our steep climb, so he had to carry his skis on his shoulder, and for some reason he was climbing in his little biking shoes as well. Side story, I remember why, is because his foot had been broken and it was in a cast for about a month, but then he kept abusing the cast he kept hiking on it basically. He had a broken pinky or a broken ankle. The cast fell apart. He then took it apart. He took it apart with pliers, and then he pulled the pin out of his foot, so his foot hurt. And so then when he were trying to climb Ptarmigan Peak, he couldn't shove his foot into his ski boot because it hurt too much. So he was wearing his little biking shoes, climbing the super gnarly mountain chute thing. Anyway, that was Abe. We'll get to him later. More Abe later. A couple of weeks earlier, a group of university students had a horrendous fall down the very same route. They were all roped together, and when one fell, he pulled the rest off like Velcro. So we are here not to die specifically and to ski a prized line in general. Yeah, like literally, like danger zone. The Couloir climbs straight for a while, then halfway up makes a hard dogleg to the left. So the entire upper part of the run is over 1,000-foot cliffs. So literally you go up, you go sideways, and then go up again. So the whole upper, you're over actual cliffs. When you boot pack straight up something steep, it can be relatively easy as long as you don't look down and as long as you make it to the top so you can easily put your skis on. The upper half was steep and we persevered to the summit free solo style. Because if it was the summertime, the snow was thick and sludge-like and it made deep runnels down the fall line like a very steep river. On the way down, we were on the skier's right side of the snow river that was about 4 feet deep and 4 feet wide. It came to the point where the river was cascading over the 1,000-foot cliffs and we had to jump across. If the snow catches even the tiniest bit of your skis, it will suck you in and pull you to certain death. We turned and jumped one at a time, and I recall I was actually on a snowboard, and I remember jumping hillside across the thing. Anyway, we turned and jumped one at a time and cruised down the safe lower slopes, conquering another mountain. The next day we set ourselves on a new adventure. The plan was to bike through Crow Pass from Girdwood to Eagle River. The route goes for 27 miles. The first 3 miles climbs up 3,000 feet right to the pass, and we plan on pushing our bikes at least that distance. From the pass, it descends roughly 2,500 feet down to the headwaters of the Eagle River over 12 miles. From the river crossing, you follow the river course for 15 miles on flat terrain to the visitor center. We figured we could bike at least 20 of the route and still be fresh enough to finish the epic loop by biking 20 miles south to Anchorage and then the final 35 push back to Girdwood. So it would be this huge giant loop. It would be roughly 85 miles of travel for the day, but we were up to it. You build momentum from trip to trip as you constantly get stronger and gain experience. We gained the pass in an hour and were excited because in theory it was all downhill from there. Right off the pass it was a bit too steep to bike, so we kept walking. Down in the vegetation again, and the trail was rocky and rooty. We were able to bike for maybe 50 yards at a time. Then we were walking. The river crossing was deep and cold. The river flows out of the frigid Eagle Lake that is ringed by 7,000-foot glaciated mountains, and icebergs float around. After we negotiated the river, we thought going would get easier. It got harder. It seemed that the water was high everywhere. The trail at this point is braided and disappears in a maze of swamp and oxbow ponds. We had to carry our bikes overhead and wade through waist-deep water for another 5 miles. The final stretch to the visitor center was brutal. There's too many routes across the trail to really pedal efficiently. By the time we got pavement, 12 hours had passed and we were beat. The next 8 miles of pavement were all right, but we were done for the day. Wet and exhausted, we called for a ride home. Remember, Abe actually barfed from exhaustion. Anyway, we were tired. I do to this day want to do that route, have a road bike waiting for me on the other end, do the pass on foot, and then road bike all the way back around. Would be pretty cool. More often than not, our adventures were human-powered feats of endurance or skill. On occasion, it was necessary or convenient to adventure via motorized vehicle. My parents had a couple of scooters they would bring along on camping trips with the motorhome. One of them was a classic step-through Barbie-like model, like Barbie and Ken would ride, with a whooping 70cc of power. The other scooter was more like a motorcycle, similar to the one they rode in Dumb and Dumber. It had big rearview mirrors and stick out like insect antennae and little 12-inch wheels. They were both street legal with a top speed of maybe 40 miles an hour. I gave the Barbie-style scooter to Abe, and I took the lead. I could keep an eye on him in the very convenient mirrors on my bike. We crawled through town along the edge of the 4-lane freeway and made our way to the Huffman and Seward Highway beyond. It was a beautiful day, and we just cruised down the shoulder as if we were bicyclists. For all intents and purposes, we were on real bikes as far as the other motorists knew. There was a crux on the trip, though. Similar to when we first biked the route in the winter the previous year, the Seward Highway goes for 25 miles or so and does not climb or drop more than 3 feet as you cruise along the mudflats of Turnagain Arm. At Bird Point, the old highway turns and climbs up 800 feet and parallels above some large cliffs that were blown out of the railway. They were building a new stretch that would continue down along the water and remain under the cliffs. The problem was that the old road did not have a shoulder to speak of, and it was twisty and bumpy, and basically a bad idea to scooter on that route. The new road was gravel, and it stretched all the way to Bird Point, except for the first 100 feet where they had ended the construction from the previous season. So basically they had this new roadway coming down. The old road went up this way, and there's a muddy trough because they didn't connect anything yet. In the gap was a rocky embankment and a slew of seawater and dreaded glacier silt mud. It was our only route. I forgot to mention that Abe's foot was in a cast, and that's why we were on these bikes in the first place. So back to that other story. This was that same time frame. And Abe, being the trooper that he would put his discomfort second to the integrity of one of our missions. I remember him stumbling and pushing his scooter across the rocks and then sliding through the mud, no doubt filling his cast in the process, which led to him having to take it apart there a week later. We struggled up on the soon-to-be new highway with smiles on our faces and cruised the last 10 miles to Girdwood in triumph. The scooters did suffer some abuse. My friend Brian had a real dirt bike, and he wanted to go exploring with me. Even though my little bike was street legal, I could still get around on the dirt. We went to Bird Creek to explore the old logging roads that crisscrossed the valley. In the parking lot, I got my bike ready and decided to cruise down the dirt road a ways to warm it up. I went about a half mile slowly and then turned around trying to go as fast as I could. The road was turning and rising up over a hill when all of a sudden here comes Brian at full speed from the opposite direction. I figure I was doing close to 30 and Brian thinks he was doing 50. There was only an instant when Brian slammed on his brakes and skidded his rear wheel around just as I T-boned his bike at full speed. Luckily, he was leaning forward over his handlebars, and I launched Superman style straight overhead and tumbled to the ground. I was wearing a helmet along with a tank top and shorts. I was pretty skidded up, all right. We decided to go home for the day. The funny thing is that I lied to my parents about why my bike was banged up and the frame was bent. I made up a story about how I ran off the road and hit a tree or something. I did not want them to think I was being reckless or stupid or anything. Which is pretty funny because all these stories are basically about being reckless or stupid. And they're not really, though. I mean, you could... And it all depends on the person, right? Like, doing any of this would be reckless or stupid, but there's a certain amount of... calculation goes into things. So that's about it for today on reading. I'm kind of tired as it is. Yeah, thanks for joining. Hit the subscribe button and stay tuned. Got about 1 million more stories coming your way.